We begin my top 36 remaining running back rankings. Remember that running backs who played on Thursday night or if they're on bye are not included in these rankings. So if you notice somebody missing and they fit under that criteria, that's why. We begin with running backs that I think are probably high end to low end RB3s. We have Dylan Labe, Jalen Wright, Devin Singletary, Jonathan Brooks, Roshan Johnson, Cam Akers, Trey Benson, Audric Estime, and Bucky Irving. Dylan Labe has only had one career touch so far in the NFL. He lost yardage and fumbled, and so he's been relegated to fourth string at running back. However, with both Zamir White and Alexander Madison likely missing this game, they're both doubtful. I do think he sees some looks in this game, and he's really good in the receiving game. Next, we have Jalen Wright, who has gone from 15 to 17 to 26% of the snap share in the past 3 weeks, as they brought him more so as the RB2 and kind of demoted Raheem Mostert to third string. I do think he's going to be quite efficient because early in the year, he was by far and away the most efficient running back out of all of them. He has had a little bit of a poor stretch here, but New England is definitely a get-right matchup, and so I think he's going to be pretty efficient. Devin Singletary is playing against Tampa Bay this week. They are 26th in allowing points to running backs, so that's a good matchup. He's definitely the backup with the emergence of Tyrone Tracy, though. I do expect him to be relatively efficient with his touches this week, though, and I think they're going to try to run the ball and use the short passing game to try to help Tommy DeVito out this week. Now we have Jonathan Brooks. In his debut, it's unfortunate coming back from his ACL that he has to play against Kansas City, who allow the fewest points to running backs. I do think he sees a couple looks in the passing game, though, and I think that's going to save his floor this week. I don't think, though, that he's a very high ceiling option for us in his debut, which we should expect some limited production in terms of the total usage. Roshan Johnson, unfortunately, is also playing against a tough defense, Minnesota, who allow the second fewest fantasy points to running backs. However, he is coming off a game in which he had 10 carries and a touchdown. I think he scores a short touchdown in this game, which saves his fantasy day, but I really don't think he has a ton of upside this week and is just a middling RB3. Now we have Cam Akers, who's had at least 9 touches in each of the past 3 weeks. I expect that to continue here against Chicago, who's a lot more vulnerable on the ground than through the air. And so I think he's going to be relatively efficient with his touches. And since he's going to see a couple grabs, I think that's going to make him a mid RB3. Now we have Trey Benson, who has seen his usage steadily climb up. He's been incredibly efficient with his touches. And it's even to the point now where they're spelling Connor by having him alternate drives here and there. And so I think with him looking good in his limited action and with him seeing increased usage, he is going to start to be a reliable, kind of mid to low end RB3 on a weekly basis, as long as Connor plays at least. And so I do think he's going to be a consistent RB3 option for us from now on, as long as Connor stays healthy. But in the event something does happen to Connor, I think he's going to be a league winner for sure. And so I think this week he's going to be efficient with his touches. Now we have Audric Estime against the Vegas Raiders. It is a fantastic matchup. It is concerning and strange, though. Strange in the sense of you would expect if somebody plays well and does nothing to give you reason to demote them in terms of their output, that you would just replace him with Javonte Williams last week. So I do expect him to see some action against Las Vegas, though, because I think they're going to easily beat Las Vegas. And so I think Estime is going to be a solid running back 3 for us, especially due to the amount of buys this week. And now we have Bucky Irving. He has scored at least 15 full PPR points in 4 of the past 5 weeks and has 3 touchdowns in the past 5 weeks. I don't think he scores a touchdown, but I do think he's going to be really efficient this week. Now we have running backs that I think are high-end RB3s to potentially low-end RB2s. We have DeAndre Swift, Javonte Williams, Chuba Hubbard, and Tony Pollard. So DeAndre Swift, after having one of the worst starts to a year that I've seen from a running back as good as him, went off for a stretch of games, but he's cooled off a little bit recently. He did have a rushing touchdown, which massively helped his output this past week. Against Minnesota in their elite run defense, I do think he's going to have a tough time, but I think that he sees a couple looks in the passing game, which is going to give him a relatively safe floor. I just don't think he has a massive ceiling this specific week. Then we have Javonte Williams, who 2 weeks ago was definitely in the backseat to Estime. Then this past week, they gave him most of the reps. So it really is tough to project. I think they're both going to have a lot of opportunity in this game. I think they're going to handily beat the Vegas Raiders. But I do think that Javonte Williams is probably the preferred play, though. It is really tough to know whatever Sean Payton's going to do from a week-to-week basis. Now we have Chuba Hubbard. He's been a revelation so far this season. They did sign him to an extension, but it's also going to be the first week in which Jonathan Brooks sees some action. That combined with the fact they're playing against Kansas City, who allowed the fewest points to running backs in fantasy, I think is going to give him some trouble, but I still think that he's a high-end RB3, low-end RB2 this week in what's a really tough matchup. And finally, we have Tony Pollard. It's also a really tough matchup for him against Houston. I do think he's going to struggle to be efficient, but I think he sees enough volume and work in the receiving game to be a solid low-end RB2 for us this week. If you like what you've seen and heard so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Also, make sure to check out my wide receivers, tight ends, and quarterback rankings videos as well, and make sure you give me a follow on X. I'm going to put that link in the description. Thanks. Now we have running backs that I think are probably in that low-end RB2 to potentially high-end RB2 range. We have JT, Rico Dowdle, J.K. Dobbins, Amir Abdullah, Aaron Jones, Austin Eckler, Ramondre Stevenson, Rashad White, Brian Robinson Jr., and Josh Jacobs. So Jonathan Taylor has been pretty good in terms of his actual play on the field, but he's been a little bit lacking due to lack of touchdowns the past couple of weeks. I do think he scores a touchdown, but I think against Detroit's tough defense that allows the fourth fewest points to fantasy running backs, it is going to limit his total output, but I still think that he's a solid low-end RB2 this week. Now we have Rico Dowdle against Washington. In the absence of Dak Prescott, he's definitely had some trouble finding room on the ground. I do think that continues, but I do think he happens to score a touchdown, and I think his usage in the passing game is going to save him and give him a decent floor. J.K. Dobbins is coming off a 2-touchdown game this past week, including the game-winning touchdown. I do think he scores a touchdown here against Baltimore, but I don't think he's going to have a massive day overall, and I don't think he's going to be that efficient, but I think he sees a ton of volume. Now we have Amir Abdullah. It's interesting seeing him and Dylan Labe in the rankings. Usually they wouldn't even be considered. But with Zamir White and Alexander Madison being doubtful, I don't expect either one of them to play. And so I really think that Amir Abdullah is the preferred play out of him and Dylan Labe. And so I do think he's going to see quite a bit of volume in what is an advantageous matchup here against Denver. Aaron Jones hasn't scored a touchdown since week 7. I think his unfortunate touchdown drought is going to continue one more week. But I do think, though, that against Chicago, he is going to be able to find some room. And I do think he's going to be utilized in the passing game. And so I think that's going to give him a really safe floor. I just don't think he has a massive ceiling this week. Austin Eckler has finished as the RB13 or better and had at least 17 fantasy PPR points in each of the past 3 weeks. I don't expect him to have 17 this game, but I do think that he's going to continue being very useful in the passing game and seeing some looks on the ground. I do think that they are going to easily be able to handle Dallas, and so I think that's going to give him some extra opportunities, and I really think he's a sneaky play this week. Ramondre Stevenson, after an RB5 and RB7 finish 3 and 4 weeks ago, has been outside the top 18 the past 2 weeks in terms of running back production. Miami is a get-right matchup. I still think that he's going to fall in that mid-RB2 range, but I do think he has a lot of upside against Miami. I don't think he scores a touchdown, but I think he's utilized quite a bit in the passing game, and I think he has a solid day in terms of his efficiency. Then we have Rashad White against the Giants. I think he isn't going to score a touchdown either, but I do think he's going to be really efficient with his touches and see a ton of work in the passing game. I really like the Tampa Bay running backs in terms of their floor from a week-to-week basis, especially with Chris Godwin being out for the remainder of the year. Now we have Brian Robinson Jr. against Dallas. I do think he scores a touchdown and is pretty efficient on the ground. I do think, though, that he and Austin Eckler are going to cannibalize each other, but I think collectively they're both very high floor, decent ceiling options who should see quite a bit of work in what should be a relatively easy win against Dallas. And now we have Josh Jacobs. He's coming off an RB5 finish this past week. He decimated Chicago. I do think, though, that he's going to have more trouble against San Fran, but I do think he scores a touchdown. Now we have running backs that I think are mid to low-end RB1s, but I don't think are likely candidates to be the RB1 this week. We have James Conner, David Montgomery, Kareem Hunt, Kenneth Walker III, Derrick Henry, and Kyron Williams. James Conner is coming off an RB4 finish, which is more impressive when you think about that he barely played over half of the snaps. He's an incredible running back. He is, however, starting to cede some work to Trey Benson, and it's not just because they've been in blowouts. Earlier in the games, they are starting to alternate series, and so I do think that we are going to start seeing him be more of a, in general, low-end RB1 to high-end RB2 due to the lack of total volume. But he's an incredible talent, and as long as he's healthy, I do think he's going to be a very strong start basically every week. I do think against Seattle, he's going to score a touchdown and be quite efficient once again. Now we have David Montgomery. He's coming off a 2 touchdown game. I don't think that happens again, but I do think he has another touchdown this week. I think he's going to be pretty efficient, and I do think he sees a couple looks in the passing game, leading to a top 12 finish this week. Now, with Kareem Hunt, he's playing against the Carolina Panthers. They allowed the second most points to running backs. I do think he's going to see a ton of volume, but I think this is going to be the last week in which that happens. I think Pacheco probably plays next week. And so I do think he's going to be a really strong start, have a fantastic day because of the matchup. I just think that in general, if you have him, try to sell him. People probably know that it's going to be the last week, but you might be able to get quite a bit for him if somebody's unaware. Kenneth Walker III has had a couple of massive games and a couple of not so great games. I do think, though, against Arizona, it's a get-right matchup. I do think he scores a touchdown, and I think he's a top 12 play. Now we have Derrick Henry against the Chargers. It is a really tough matchup, but he is the only running back that has scored a touchdown in every single week this season. Considering that, it's really hard to have him outside of the top 12 very often, and even in a tough matchup, I do think he sees quite a bit of volume, and I do think he scores another touchdown. Then we have Kyron Williams, who until 3 weeks ago had scored at least one touchdown in every single game. He's been on a terrible drought. I do think he finally breaks a streak this week, and I think he sees some passing game involvement overall, and I do think that makes him a top 8 play this week. Now we have running backs that I think are mid to elite RB1s this week, and I think are likely candidates to be the RB1. We have Tyrone Tracy, Christian McCaffrey, Jahmyr Gibbs, Devon Achane, Saquon Barkley, and Joe Mixon. So Tyrone Tracy has had at least 100 total yards in 3 of the past 6 games. I think Tampa Bay is absolutely a matchup in which he's going to do that. I do think he scores a touchdown as well, and I think you see some passing game involvement with Tommy DeVito starting. I think for the rest of the season, in plus matchups, he is a top 10 option. He is incredible on the ground, and he's an asset in the receiving game as well. And I do think they're going to utilize him steadily as the clear RB1 in this backfield. Then we have Christian McCaffrey against Green Bay. It's a middle-of-the-road matchup. He hasn't been the elite top-shelf RB1 the past 2 weeks. His efficiency on the ground hasn't been that great. I do think, though, that with Brock Purdy not playing, they're going to give him a lot of work, especially in the receiving game. I actually don't have him projected for a touchdown, but I think he sees a ton of volume in this game. Now we have Jahmyr Gibbs against Indianapolis. He's coming off a game in which he did score a touchdown, just like his running back mate, David Montgomery. I think that he, just like Montgomery, scores another touchdown this week. I think he sees some work in the receiving game, and I do think he finishes with over 100 total yards. Now we have Devon Achane playing against New England. He scored at least 20 full PPR points in 3 of the past 4 weeks. I think that happens for a 4th week out of 5. I think he's a top 3 play. I think he scores a touchdown, has over 100 total rushing and receiving yards combined, with a couple of receptions, making him a top 3 play. Now we have Saquon Barkley against the Rams. They do allow the 8th fewest points to running backs, but he's also had over 30 full PPR points in 2 of the past 3 weeks. I don't expect that to continue, but I do think he sees a ton of volume in this game, does score a touchdown, and potentially sees some extra work in the receiving game with the absence of Devontae Smith this week. And finally, we have Joe Mixon against Tennessee. He's coming off a game in which he had 3 rushing touchdowns. He's about as good of a bet as anybody to have 20 full PPR points basically every single week. Even though Tennessee's defense does allow the 13th fewest points to running backs, I really think that Joe Mixon is about as matchup proof as it gets at the running back position. And so to review, running backs that I think are high end to low end RB3s this week, we have Dylan Labe, Jalen Wright, Singletary, Brooks, Johnson, Akers, Benson, Estime, and Irving. Running backs that I think are high end RB3s to potentially low end RB2s. We have DeAndre Swift, Javonte Williams, Chuba Hubbard, and Tony Pollard. Running backs that I think are probably high-end RB2s to potentially low-end RB2s. We have Jonathan Taylor, Rico Dowdle, Dobbins, Abdullah, Jones, Eckler, Stevenson, White, Robinson, and Jacobs. Running backs that I think are probably mid to low-end RB1s, but I don't think are likely candidates to be the RB1. We have James Conner, David Montgomery, Kareem Hunt, Kenneth Walker, Derrick Henry, and Kyron Williams. And then running backs that I think are mid to elite RB1s with a likely chance of being the RB1 this week. We have Tyrone Tracy, Christian McCaffrey, Jahmyr Gibbs, Devon Achane, Saquon Barkley, and Joe Mixon. All right, so you know the drill. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Is there somebody that I'm not projecting for enough fantasy points that's not included in this list? If so, let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. With that being said, if you like what you've seen and heard, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. And make sure you check out my wide receivers, tight ends, and quarterback rankings as well. And make sure you give my profile on X a follow. I'm going to leave that in the description. Thanks.